Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and we're going to take a look at some viewer questions now, or we'll at least ask them and answer them, or do our best to. So this is, finally we're moving past our Neidorf Sicilian series. At least we're trying to, so stay tuned for one of the questions and we'll see if we completely succeed in that endeavor. Okay, so I'm not sure exactly where I left off, but I think the following batch covers most, if not all, of the questions that have come since the last one, and certainly I think enough for one program. Okay, so here we go. First one is from Frenchie501, who asks, how does an FM become a GM? And he doesn't mean by this, what's the procedure in terms of getting norms and that sort of thing, but rather, what kinds of things would I do to improve, since I'm an FM and hopefully will still improve. So he asks, would I go through a book like Fisher's My 60 Memorable Games, look at a DVD in the Ilyakin's defense, or, what will I do? Well, I would say that really for any level of chess player, there's still room for improvement in every single aspect. Even grandmasters make positional errors. They have more to learn about openings. Of course, in their case, they're the trendsetter, so it's not so much that they're trying to learn the book as they're trying to extend the frontiers of opening theory. But, they have to learn existing theory as well. Sometimes they switch openings or variations and have to learn what's gone before making their own contributions. And they make, strategic errors, endgame errors, you name it. So everyone makes some sort of error when pushed far enough. You have these matches between grandmasters and the top computer programs playing on state-of-the-art software, and the grandmasters get their heads handed to them. So we all have room to improve. So what kinds of things do we do? Well, the same kinds of things really that you should do and that any player should do. And it's just that you look for a level of difficulty that's challenging. So, I work on tactics like anybody else, and the key is that I'm looking for tactical positions that are going to be challenging for me. So, I don't spend as much time looking at books where the tactics are, basic pins and skewers and double attacks and discovered attacks and so on. Though sometimes I do that just for review, just to kind of sharpen up before a tournament as a little warm-up exercise. So even there, I'll do that kind of thing. But, when I'm trying to improve, essentially what you want to do, what I want to do, what anyone wants to do, is to look for material that's challenging. Okay, not impossible, not simple, not trivial to that particular person, but challenging, and to work on it. So that helps to kind of develop your mental muscle, so to speak. And of course, you look for specific information as well. So you have to learn this or that little bit of opening theory, and fill in the gaps with things you don't know in essential endgame theory, and you analyze. And again, the sorts of things that every single chess player should do, needs to do, is what an FM or even a grandmaster ought to do to try to improve. Okay, so the next question comes from Kornrad or Kornrada, depending on what language and what nationality is the person's in question. Anyway, so the question is, or questions, what other concepts does the computer fail with other than, so he kind of categorizes these into several headings. So the first would be things like fortresses, stalemate tricks, and perpetuals. In all of these cases where it's kind of a long-range thing. So that would be one broad category. Second category would be strategic elements like Zugzwang, where it says pure strategy, and then these monster problems like these Blathy, ridiculous problems that go like 220 moves or more. A third would be horizon effect positions, and a fourth are what he calls constrictor, and he links to a study, which actually was a very nice study, so you should check that out. Look for his question in the thread where it's about asking me a question. Look for his Kornrad's, or Kornrade, and then he links to a puzzle or a study that he composed, which is actually quite nice. So anyway, back to the question. What else does the computer fail with? And okay, so what I wanted to say is that many of his examples really seem to me to be instances of the horizon effect. So that I think is essentially the computer's fundamental problem. It's most of its quote unquote knowledge is really not so much knowledge, but a listing of factors that it should analyze. So the computer knows, quote unquote, to look at, to evaluate. Okay, what's the pawn structure? How many pieces are around the king? What kinds of pawns are there? The mobility of the pieces, the direct threats, space. I mean, there are really thousands of these factors. I mean, programmers have found ingenious ways of really making these into micro factors and really fine-graining them all. But essentially that's what it is. It's finding this or that little element, of course all subordinated to checkmate, and of course material too. And the interplay of these things all put together gets you to your answer. And so none of these are kind of high-level concepts of the sort that humans operate with. So, we think about things like a blockade, a fortress, things of that nature, or we can see that a position is going to be a perpetual, even if for a computer to work out to be a perpetual might take it 60 half moves down the road, because it's not just two squares back and forth, but it could involve one side moving the king around for quite some time before a 3-time repetition anywhere shows up. Okay, so that was one batch. Also, I was going to mention that what he calls constrictor, there's a name for that already in the study world, and it's domination. So perhaps there's a little difference that he has in mind, but domination, I think, is typical there. And he should check out, or any of you should check out if you're interested in domination studies. There's this large book by Genrikh Kasparian, the great Armenian study composer, and it's something like 1234, some big number of domination studies. Not all by him, so by many different authors. Anyway, to add to what he says, I think, again, fundamentally everything has to do with the horizon effect in one form or another. So if you can think of positions where there's something looming down the road that's tough for the computer to see, well, that would be a candidate. So one thing I've certainly noticed in the past is when one side is trying to build up an attack. Let's say something like a closed Sicilian kind of deal. Doesn't have to be in the closed Sicilian, but let's say you've got kind of a locked center, and the forces start to slowly amass on one side of the board where the defender's king is going to be. That would be one instance where, at least historically, computers have failed to sense the danger in time. But I think he's done a good job of selecting the main instances. And I would just add that as a kind of a typical situation where computers can sometimes fail to sniff out the danger. So in positions where one side is able to build on the wing, and when the threats finally do come, it may be too late for the computer. Certainly that's been a major kind of strategy for anti-computer players for a long time. They try things like the stone wall with white, or various kinds of modern or hippo setups. And they sometimes work still, though programmers, of course, are aware of this and do their best to both find ways of combating this and of not allowing these kinds of situations to arise in the first place. Okay, next question is from Nucleus, and he asks about the Botvinnik structure, how to meet it with black if you're a King's Indian player. And, okay, I'm a little theoried out at the moment, but I'll just mention, he asks about C5 versus E5 plans. And so I would say, so just to get the kind of setup he's kind of asking about here, let's say something like this. Okay, so the question is, should black go for C5 plans or E5 plans? And I would say, or neither. He says he's tried both with difficulty, but I think the C5 plans are perfectly fine. So you end up with a kind of a closed Sicilian type structure, and black is going to go for his queenside play. So you'll have knight C6 and A6 and rook B8 and B5, and you'll attempt to go for counterplay over there. Now, of course, white is going to play a kind of a big build-up. So you have stuff like D3, H3, Bishop E3, G4, Knight to G3, maybe F4, and so on. But as long as black's pawn remains on E7, it's going to be difficult for white to achieve something like F6. And without F6, it's kind of hard for that final breakthrough to occur on the king side. So you need to know something certainly about this setup. I can also put the bishop on D7. The knight often goes to D4. And sometimes this knight from f8, one typical idea is for it to go to e8 to c7, and then maybe it's the one that goes to d4. All right, so that's a very standard kind of reply to the Botvinnik system. And at the end of the day, you just have to play chess. I mean, it's playable for white, it's playable for black, and perhaps the thing to do is, and I think the questioner mentioned this, try playing it with the other side. Try to play it with white. Play it against your computer. So your computer will no doubt crush you because it crushes everybody. But you can learn and see how it responds to it, and then try to borrow its idea, and then switch colors. So that's a useful approach. Something else you can do, of course, is to just get out the database and look at games with high-rated players that feature this position. See what they did. See what their plans are for both sides. See how they responded, and work it out from there. So that would be my suggestion about handling this. So specific recommendation: c5. You go for the knight going to d4, maybe the f knight, maybe the b knight, b8 knight, and queenside expansion. And don't push the e pawn unless it's to take something on f6, or unless you're getting something really great out of it. All right. So next question. This comes from Modern Elite, and he asks, okay, explain the minority attack. Now, there was someone who responded and gave a little bit of an idea, but let's give an illustration and you can see it for yourself. All right, so we'll start with a very typical opening variation in which it occurs. So let's do it like this. All right, let's just zip ahead here. c6, queen c2. All right, this has all happened literally thousands and thousands of times, and we can quibble about this or that move. There are different options every step of the way. All right, but here is, let's say, a typical spot. And just to give one kind of simple illustration of how we can get the minority attack. So here, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and then b4. Okay, now the minority attack doesn't have to arise in this kind of pawn structure, but it generally does. So let's go back a move here. So it'll generally happen, and it can be with reverse colors too. So let me show another example. But we'll spend most of our time on that one. So e4, c6, d4, d5, takes, bishop d3, and we've got the exchange variation. And here, okay, so we'll just get everybody out here. All right, and now rook a to e1, and rook a to b8. Okay. So these are really the same pawn structure. So look at the structure, take a good look. Now look at this one. Oh, we'll go back to here. So it's essentially the same structure, just with colors reversed. Okay? So one side is missing an e pawn, the other side is missing the c pawn. Now, it's called a minority attack because you're going to attack with pawns on the side where you have fewer. So you have the pawn minority in effect. So black has a pawn majority, has 4 pawns over here, and white only has 3 guys. So that's what makes it a minority. And the idea behind the minority attack, okay, so what constitutes it in this kind of situation always is b4. And the idea is, not surprisingly, to play b5. What's the idea behind this? Well, the point is that right now black's pawn structure is completely clean. So there are no isolated pawns. It's all very nice and compact. Most of the pawns are protecting each other. Well, not most. Half of the pawns are protecting each other, and the other 2 pawns are thoroughly safe, sitting on their starting spot. So by playing b5, black is going to be faced with a dilemma. So after, let's say, all right, the most popular move here is bishop to g4, but okay, let's just do bishop to g4, no big deal. Knight to d2, and all right, let's say rook to c8. Nah, okay, this is too uncooperative. So let me just choose some cooperative move. Okay, bishop to e6. There we go. All right, so here white can play b5 should he so desire. May not be the very best move in the position, but it suffices for our purposes. So black is faced with a dilemma of sorts. If black takes, okay, white recaptures, however, let's say with the bishop, and now there's this isolated e pawn. Plus, there's an open B file, and let's say white can put a rook here at some point, and okay, either force black to defend it with a piece, or if he plays B6, then we could have maybe a second minority attack with A4 and A5, with the goal of creating an isolated pawn over there. Okay, so that would be one idea. And also, as I said, okay, so the isolated D pawn, white could also try to lay siege to it with bishop A4, bishop to B3. There's just one possibility. And the point is, it's just a long-term, slight but genuine weakness. Another idea might be knight E1, D3, F4. So various ways of trying to ramp up a little pressure against it. So it's not a lot, but it's a little bit. It's a little something to kind of nag black with. All right, so that's if c takes b5. Option 2, let's say black does absolutely nothing. Let's say he plays something like rook c8. Okay, well here we could take. Now if rook takes, then we end up in the same situation. Of course it's bad here because the bishop's b5, but ignore the tactical details. So we're just discussing the structure. Okay, so the point is if rook takes c6, then it's the same thing as if black had played c takes b5. Okay, so let's say b takes c6 instead. Well, now, okay, the a pawn is isolated. That's not such a big deal. But a bigger deal is that the c pawn is backward on an open file, or a half-open file. So white's going to play things like knight to a4, and can not only start to attack this pawn on c6, but also enjoy the c5 pawn as an outpost for his own pieces. So the c6 pawn functions, in effect, like an isolated pawn. It's backward. It has no pawn that can protect it, and so it's weak, and the square in front of it is more easily accessible to the opponent than to black. Okay. Another possibility that sometimes arises, though not in this particular case, would be to have the c5 resource. So let's consider this just for the sake of setting it up. So let's say c5 here. So this is still another possible way that black can respond to the minority attack. So takes and takes, and okay, so black's queenside pawns are fine. Well, the a and b pawns are fine, and again ends up with an isolated d pawn, and white can have his fun playing rook f to d1, and again trying to pile up on it. So at any rate, that's the basic idea behind the minority attack. It's to exchange a pawn, and however this exchange occurs, black either ends up with this backward c6 pawn and an isolated a pawn too, but that's usually not so serious for quite a while. And or on the other hand, as here and in a couple of other positions, an isolated d pawn. Okay, so that's the idea. And the same occurs, I should say, in that Caro-Kann variation too. And this is also good for pointing out white's idea, or let's say the non-minority attack side's idea, which is to try to use the e file to put a knight on e5. And in the other situation, black often tries to put a knight on e4, which is one of the points behind bishop takes f6 in that variation, to prevent it. So here, for example, knight to e5, and now black plays b5, let's say a3, a5, f4, b4, takes, queen d1, takes, and okay, and this is another known position. Black will try to make some kind of progress on the queen side, and white is going to go for an attack on the king side. And theoretically speaking, black is okay, but it's a very simple system for white to play, and black's results and white's results are fine too. So again, playable for both sides, and it's a kind of situation where if you know some ideas, you can play it against basically anyone. Now there are other systems that black can play against this, but you'll get this even against very good players. Okay, anyway, enough about the minority attack. Let's hit the next one. Okay, this is from Zazi or Zazi, and he asks about the training game between Mikhail Tal and his trainer Alexander Koblenz, and he asks, can I analyze it? Well, yeah, I can analyze it, but okay, the question is, will I analyze it? And first, I'm going to say no, not unless you spell my name correctly, and since you didn't, no Tal Koblenz for you. Okay. Kind of kidding there. Second, more seriously, I've already analyzed this, actually twice. So a long time ago I did it for Chess, for Chess FM, back when they were first starting out. And then I've since done it for ChessBase. In fact, I did it, excuse me, I believe last December. So you can find it in the archives there on the Play Chess server, which is the server that you get through Fritz or through ChessBase. So you can find it there, and I hope you do. Frankly, it's one of my favorite games. In fact, it was the very first game I ever did a presentation on for anybody. So look that up, but I'm not going to redo it for here. The only reason why I redid it on ChessBase is because the play chess ones, they disappeared. There are some online places where they've stolen it, frankly, but it's not available on Chess FM anymore. So that's why I chose to redo it. Okay, on to the next question from Prospero. And he asks, what are the tea leaves for white to decide the right middle game plan in the Ruy Lopez? Do you go for d4? Do you not go for the d4? Do you play on the king side? Do you try to attack black's queenside weaknesses? And so on. What do you do? Okay, well, just to give a broad idea of what I assume he's talking about, let's look at a mainline Ruy here. So knight f3, knight c6 here. Okay, and this, again, makes sense really in the context of the closed Ruy, not in the open or one of the other sidelines along the way, and doesn't really make sense in the Marshall either. So we'll look at this kind of position. Okay, well, the thing is, and this sort of leads me jokingly to think about, a 15-minute or, super fast Ruy Lopez. Right. We're going to avoid that. Anyway, black has so many choices here. I mean, it can play knight to a5. This is the Chigorin, which is one of the main variations. And the main line starts off like this. Okay, so white's already committed to d4 here. I mean, this happens very, very quickly. Likewise, in another main variation, the Breyer variation with knight to b8, white plays d4 straight away here. So, I mean, this is, again, altogether typical in this position. And, again, this has happened thousands and thousands of times, and there are just lots and lots of possibilities here. This knight maneuver is very common. And then here, for instance, I mean, white can play a move like a4, c5, okay, d5. All these things, I mean, this just happens so many times, and there's just an awful lot of theory to know about this. So even this position has occurred hundreds and hundreds of times for, over many, many decades. All right, bishop to g5, etc. Rook a3, I mean, this goes back, I mean, I've seen this in games from the 1960s. It was already known then. I believe Tal played this against Gligerich in their candidates match. So, I mean, we can go crazy with this. In the Zaitsev variation, okay, Karpov popularized this tremendously. Also, I made a good little joke about this on my blog recently, so you should check that out. Clever little segue there. chessmind.powerblogs.com. Do check that out. I think you'll enjoy it. Anyway, bishop to b7, d4. So anyway, in most of these main lines in the closed Ruy Lopez, so this is kind of like the basic position of the closed Ruy, where there are a lot of different moves, but maybe the three most common are, again, knight a5, knight to b8, and bishop to b7. d4 happens in basically all of them. So that's kind of standard. Also very standard in almost all of these variations is for this knight to go to d2 and to f1 and then sometimes to e3, sometimes to g3. Okay, this bishop will often retreat to c2. Not always, but it does happen pretty often. In part, well, sometimes because there's a knight going to a5 that attacks it. On other occasions, it's because there can be pressure against the e-pawn. So let's say after rook e8 and bishop f8, there are threats to take. And to bother this, so the bishop often goes back, as I said, to c2 to protect it. So all of these are very typical. And what white does after that, well, it depends on what black does. Also, it depends, many of these variations, what white does on the queen side, again, depends on what black does. So there really aren't any simple tea leaves. I mean, one thing I will say that is fairly common. So let's go back to this Chigorin position. Okay, queen c7, knight b to d2. Okay, here, if black plays a move like bishop to b7, it's not the most common move, but it is a common move. White plays d5. All right, so we saw it here, and we saw it in our Breyer variation. Where white played d5. Okay, so from this we can extrapolate two things, and it's dangerous to extrapolate on such a small sample, but I think these points are fairly legit. So one is that when black plays bishop to b7, d5 can be an okay idea. Not necessarily a fantastic idea, but okay, because then the bishop on b7 is dead once a pawn is already on c5. See, if there's still a pawn on c7, then black can often play c6, liberating the bishop and giving it this nice diagonal. On the other hand, once he does that, then there can be a hole on d5. So meeting bishop to b7 at some point with d5 is not especially unusual. Quoting Tom Jones, right? It's not unusual. It happens all the time. And so here too, d5. And the bishop often ends up retreating to c8 here. So, but what do you do? I mean, when do you decide these things? Because sometimes white's going to take on c5 and go for this open center. That's, of course, more likely to occur when there's not a bishop here helping to control this. So there's this old Rouser plan with knight f1, knight e3, knight to d5. But sometimes, if d5 is well covered, you don't make that exchange on c5 and occupy it. So sometimes the knight goes instead to f5. Or sometimes you play knight h2 and queen f3 and knight h to g4, and you try to attack that way. Another plan, in some variations, when the center gets closed, so let's say a position like this, sometimes white will play g4, knight f1, knight g3, king h2, rook g1, knight f5. So there's just a tremendous number of plans. And sometimes, yes, white does play on the queen side. Sometimes white will play a4, not in this position, but there are other variations where white will play a4, swap on b5. So let's go back to something like this. Okay, so sometimes this kind of thing does happen. Let's say black's knight is moved around someplace. Okay, actually, instead of that, let's just look at a briar again. Okay, so a position like, let's start from here. Okay, sometimes white plays a4 quickly, or b3 and a4, takes, and especially when black has played c5, and let's say we take again, and then bishop to d3 and queen e2. So sometimes that kind of plan occurs as well, putting pressure on the b pawn, and black can't play c4 because white has the pawn on b3, really restricting that advance. And okay, if black plays b4, then it gives up a bunch of light squares. So that's an idea that occurs sometimes, but again, the thing to do is you just learn these variations one at a time. So you look at some theory, you look at games played in these variations, and you get an idea, what do the best players do in these kinds of scenarios? So really the same thing that I mentioned to the person who asked about meeting the Botvinnik structure, what do you do there? So the same thing, same kinds of procedures are really necessary, and there's no superficial answer to this kind of question, especially in an opening as rich as the closed Rui. I mean, I believe, I don't remember who it was that devised or came up with this saying, but it's been called the touchstone of mastery to be able to play the closed Ruy Lopez. So if this is considered to be one of the great arts in the art of chess, then 3-minute or 5-minute answer saying, okay, if this happens then that, if that happens then that, is simply not going to cut it. So it's something you develop from experience. So there are various possibilities, and you can get some idea by examining a lot of them, and you develop a feel for it. But it's not a recipe. Okay, question from Marcin Z, and he asks, can I make a repertoire video for white versus the poison pawn? Okay, so first answer is, again, not if you misspell my name. So no poison pawn repertoire for you. All right. Secondly, I'm Najdorfed out, so just forget about it. We're not going to look at any more Najdorfs. For you Najdorf junkies out there, I've done the best to satisfy you that I can. You're going to have to wait. Sorry. And then third of all, you really can't do it anyway because the theory changes on it all the time. So I gave you guys a lot of what's going on in current theory, and in the F5 lines, I pretty much, I didn't cover everything, but I covered some of the current lines all the way down to the ground. All 30-plus moves leading to perpetual check. And in the E5 lines, I pointed out what the main variations are there as well. So you're going to have to do that yourself and just follow the theory. And I would say too, if I have some brilliant novelty in the poison against the poison pawn, sorry guys, but I'm not going to share it with you. I want to use it if I've got some killer shot against this opening, because it's very important. So do your own research on that. I think I did a very good job of giving you guys a lay of the land, and follow the theory. It develops all the time. It's a major variation. Okay, finally from Camus, he asks, what are my views about talent? Okay, so in other words, are people born with the ability to become a Kasparov or, whatever? Or, is it hard work, training? How is a world champion made? Or at least what are my views about this? Okay, well, I have a few views, and I've actually been reading a lot of the books lately that try to downplay the role of talent. And I have to say a number of things, so I'm glad you brought this up. So first of all, the reason why I started reading these books is because there have been a large number of popular presentations that seem to suggest that talent just doesn't exist. That it's all about the 10,000 hour rule, or the 10,000 hour rule applied correctly, where the thought is, okay, if you spend 10,000 hours of practice in any domain, you're going to become a high-level expert in that domain. And by expert, I don't mean a 2,000 rated player. I mean that you're going to be very, very proficient. You'll even be a professional grade, whatever it is that you've spent 10,000 hours on. And talent simply isn't a factor. Okay. Now, as I've read these books, so I've looked at books like Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, and Talent is Overrated by Jeff Colvin, and what's the other one? The Talent Code by Coyle, or Coyne, not Coyle. I believe it's Coyne. One second. Yeah, Daniel Coyle. Okay, I was right the first time. So anyway, none of these guys say that talent doesn't exist. Colvin comes closest, but the other two don't say it at all, and even Colvin doesn't quite go that far. So I think that's simply false. Second point is, of course, it's not just 10,000 hours, punching your time clock, but it's 10,000 hours of really rigorous, this kind of deep practice where you're doing things that are going to push you. Not that they're impossible, but that they're challenging. So what I mentioned before, so I was basically cribbing those guys when I gave that answer. Although it's something that I would have said even before that. So that's second. So you do need to put your time in, and it has to be the right kind of time. But yeah, I mean, I'm still inclined to think that there is such a thing as talent. But okay, I am willing to say I think that it's more or less meaningless for the overwhelming percentage of the population. All right, so for the vast majority of us, it doesn't really matter. It may matter, let's say, it probably doesn't even matter for being an international master. Maybe it doesn't even matter for a grandmaster, an ordinary kind of low 2,500 guy. It might matter for a Kasparov, Anand, a Kramnik, someone who's a world champion, someone who's kind of a prodigy. But okay, it could even conceivably be that they started early enough, they had the right kind of training, they had the motivation, so they may have had all the kind of luck you need for the hard work to work out. Okay, possibly. But anyway, for most of us, we put in our time doing challenging work, so, not watching Fritz, DVDs passively, but, doing hard work, doing guess the move with Grandmaster games, carefully analyzing one's own games, working on endings, all the kinds of things that really push us and that are uncomfortable even, but, force us to really work our brains, work our minds as hard as possible. That's the quote-unquote secret to success. So the same kinds of things you have to do to be good in anything. Hard practice, disciplined practice on relevant skills. Okay. And then he asks a follow-up question. He says, what conceptual milestones did I recognize in my own development or in others? For example, developing tactical vision, mastering king and pawn endings, developing insights in a positional sense, switching to mature openings, that kind of thing. Okay. I would say I read this one place, and it sounded, it actually made sense. So there was a player who had improved and kind of asked, was asked a similar question. And he said, well, I wasn't aware of anything. I wasn't aware of any change in me, but I was aware that I was improving because all the people that I played all of a sudden seemed pretty weak. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, there were players with whom I was peers when I was a kid, growing up, and we were all kind of bunched. I mean, I was better than some of them. Some of them were a little bit better than I was, but I think I worked the hardest. And okay, maybe I was the most talented, but maybe not. But I put in my hours. I was maybe a little bit more mentally flexible than they were, and over time, they went from being peers to people that I could beat. That I would score 75% or better against, and more like 80 to 90% against. And this happened over a period of maybe 2 years of really pretty intensive work. So, I think that's really the case. I mean, you put your time in on all of these things. I mean, you study games, you analyze your own games, and you work on everything. You do tactics practice and study endings, all the usual stuff. I mean, there's no really magic secret to this. I mean, it's not if you just get this DVD or if you just start working on this opening or follow X's program to tactical mastery. It's all a bunch of what. You can buy any of dozens of tactics books. They're all going to do the job. You can buy any of dozens of endgame books. They're all going to do the job. Okay. I mean, some are a little bit better than others. The presentation's a little bit nicer. Fine. What counts is what you put into it. Okay. You can take the worst endgame book, just about, and if you figure the things out for yourself and you test what you come up with what the author found, you're going to grow. You're going to develop as a chess player, and that's all there is to it. You can take the worst book on Bobby Fischer's games or Karpov's games or Kasparov's games, whoever it is. I mean, as long as everything's just not wrong. But I mean, even if it's a fairly superficial book, and you just play a guess the move game with Kasparov's games, and take your time, take an hour, take 2 hours to go through each game, and then when you're done, compare what you've found with his moves and with the commentators' suggestions, and then maybe at the end of all of that, try to figure out what was wrong with what you did, if anything, and then at the end of that, maybe test it with the computer to see how your analysis fared and if your moves were just as good or if they weren't. Do all of that, and you're going to improve tremendously. Okay, so you could do that with the videos that I'm doing. All right, so I'm presenting some game of my own. Okay, it's not a Kasparov level game, so you're not going to get as much value maybe, but maybe I'm also closer in strength, so it may be a little bit more manageable. But you can do the exact same thing, where you stop the recording after every move I make, try to guess what I do before I blather too much, and you can figure it out. So anything like that can be worthwhile. Though I would suggest really not doing it. It's not as valuable with the video because I'm talking all the time, and so you're already being influenced by that. But that kind of thing. So interactive participation in a game where you're trying your best to make yourself a participant rather than a spectator. Great exercise. Okay, so enough of me talking. I'm sure you're all mostly bored by now. And for those of you who aren't, I hope you'll take the suggestions to heart. So thank you very much. I'll see you next week, and hopefully I'll have some good games of my own to show you. So I'm playing in an I Am Norm tournament now. As you get this, it's finishing up by the time you hear this. For me, it's still a couple of days away. So anyway, hopefully I'll have lots of wonderful games to show you. From my point of view, they'll be even more wonderful if I win, but if it's an instructive loss, I may show that as well. So we'll see. Anyway, I will see you when I get back, and thank you very much. Bye-bye.